Hello, I'm Brenton Simons, and I'm here with my co-host, Curt DiCamillo. Hello, Curt. How are you?
Hello.
And welcome to the Antiquarto, an online series of conversations produced by American ancestors and the New England Historic Genealogical Society. Today, we serve more than 355,000 members in all 50 states and in 138 countries with billions of online records at americanancestors.org. Today, Curt and I have a very special guest, a friend who is a multi-talented individual who I've known for a number of years, who is Charlie Courtney. And Charlie is, along with his wife, actress A.J. Langer, they are patrons of Mayflower 400, the UK-based charity that is commemorating the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing. He is also a member of the House of Lords. We're going to discuss that, and a barrister and 19th Earl of Devon. Welcome, Charlie.
Hey, Brenton, nice to see you.
And I should just say you're coming to us from Powderham Castle.
Yes, one of the achievements of our 5 years of tenure is to get Wi-Fi into the middle of the castle, so I can sit here in the marble hall and speak to you on my iPhone.
Well, we're very excited you're here, and I know we're going to see a little bit more of your wonderful home in a few minutes. But why don't we start with the 400th commemorations? And I was curious as to what about the story of the Pilgrims attracted you and AJ to this charity and to become its patrons?
Well, the Mayflower, as many of your viewers will know, set sail. Its last point of departure from the UK was Plymouth, which is in Devon. And as the Earl and Countess of Devon, AJ and I were invited to get involved in the Mayflower 400th anniversary about 5 or 6 years ago by the town leaders in Plymouth. And as an Anglo-American couple, AJ comes from California, we thought it was a perfect opportunity to explore the common links between our nations, between Holland as well, which is part of the commemoration, and the Wampanoag Nation, which is the fourth member of the Mayflower 4 nation commemorations. So it's been a real adventure for us. We've learned so much about the Mayflower story, the difficult issues around Native American heritage, the difficult issues around colonialism and the role of West Country fishermen and sailors in mastering the North Atlantic. But it's been a great opportunity to really bring some communities and cultures together.
And I recall you and I discussed, you were distantly related to some of the Mayflower passengers.
Yes, I think Thomas Rogers, who was one of the Mayflower passengers, is a descendant of the Courtney family. My family's been resident here in Devon since 1152 and has a relatively identifiable pedigree. And so one of the Mayflower voyagers, Thomas Rogers, is a descendant of our family. So some of our genes, I think, went over on the Mayflower.
And what's happened, Charlie, in the wake of COVID-19? I imagine some of the commemorations have been postponed or put online.
Yes, Plymouth worked a really broad program of events for Mayflower 400. 1 or 2 large events were planned, certainly around September of last year, which was the departure date, which couldn't go ahead. But thankfully, a number of the projects happened online. The Wampanoag built a wampum belt that has been on exhibition in Plymouth. And they built this amazing box museum, which has a fascinating Mayflower exhibition. And that has been completed and is opening as we're coming out of lockdown. People are able to go. And then one of the most exciting projects was the Mayflower Autonomous Ship project, whereby a number of academics and engineering firms got together and created an autonomous vessel that will follow the path of the Mayflower from Plymouth to Plymouth, totally under its own steam, controlling itself, using AI to steer itself and get its way from here to there.
And we're looking forward to its arrival in a short while. let me change the subject a little bit to the House of Lords, if I may. In 2018, you were elected to the House of Lords, and can you say something to our American viewers about what that means, how one is elected, and what you're doing, what you do in the House of Lords?
Yes, we have a bicameral system, much like the United States. You have a Senate and a House of Representatives. We have a House of Lords and a House of Commons. The Commons are the democratically elected members of Parliament. The Lords tend to be either appointed for life, as in life peers, or those such as myself who are hereditary peers. Traditionally, all the Lords were hereditary peers, but in the 1990s, the number was decreased by democratic demand to only 92. So there are 92 hereditary peers sitting in the House of Lords. When one of those peers either dies or retires, there is a vacancy, and other hereditary peers can put themselves forward to take his or her seat. And a couple of years ago, I decided to throw my hat into the ring and see if I couldn't take a seat. And I was fortunate enough to get elected.
And as I recall, you had quite a few competing candidates.
It was rather like the Game of Thrones, I think, was my experience. I think there were 32 electors, 18 candidates, and the 18 candidates had to sit in a circle of chairs, and the 32 electors sit in a circle of chairs outside of them and throw questions, and you had about 2 hours of grilling. And after that, there is an elected process. And ultimately, we end up being the only elected members in the House of Lords because everybody else is appointed. But as many will point out, the electorate is quite a rarefied bunch.
And are you still practicing law?
Yeah, so I qualified as a barrister in the UK in the late 90s. I moved to California after meeting my wife in 2004 and practiced as a California attorney until about 2014. And now I'm back here in the UK practicing both as a California attorney and as a UK barrister. So I combine practices and have a fascinating practice between the US and the UK. It's been really interesting in the last few years.
Well, I'm so impressed with how you do it all, that you have a very busy life in addition to managing a great estate and having a young family. So that is impressive. And I must say that this actually opens up the next section I wanted to talk about. I was fortunate enough to visit Charlie at the House of Lords and really have a bit of a view into the Courtney family history going back at the House of Lords. And little did I know at the time, I paid very close attention, but little did I know at the time that I too have an early Courtney line. So as I look back on that, it makes our visit even more special. But the Courtneys are a fascinating and ancient family. And maybe you could say that, I guess there have been several creations and recreations of the earldom, and it went into abeyance and was finally restored in the 19th century. Can you tell our viewers in brief a little bit about the saga of the Devon earldom?
Yes, it's got a relatively long and, as you say, a tragic story at times. The Courtney family is French. We come from Burgundy, about 100 miles south of Paris. And the patriarch Athon de Courtenay fortified the town of Courtenay in about 1000 AD. His children and grandchildren went off and fought in the Crusades. And as a result, we have a coat of arms, which you can see here, which is 3 red spots of Christ's blood. A couple of generations later, they fell out with Louis the Fat and were banished to the furthest reaches of the Plantagenet Angevin Empire. And so they were sent across to England with Eleanor of Aquitaine. And that is when we settled in Devon. And we've been here ever since. We married into the Norman earldom of Devon, the de Redvers family. They'd held the earldom of Devon since its creation by the Empress Matilda in 1142. And when they ran out of male heirs, we were there in about 1335 to pick up the earldom. And so from 1335 to the present day, the Courtney family have been the Earls of Devon, save for, as you point out, a number of beheadings and attainders, 3 or 4 during during the Wars of the Roses, and the final one, rather unfortunately, by Henry VIII. And Henry VIII beheaded his first cousin, who was a Courtenay, Henry, the Marquis of Exeter and Earl of Devon. And I think you can see Henry's portrait behind me on the wall. He was beheaded by Henry VIII because he plotted against the marriage of Anne Boleyn and lost his title. His son was imprisoned in the Tower of London and grew up, young Edward Courtney, as a prisoner alongside the princesses Mary and Elizabeth. And when Mary was released and became herself the Queen of England, one of the first things she did was to release her cousin Edward and recreate him Earl of Devon. So I count number 19, I'm the 19th Earl of Devon, but that's only from the Marian creation of 1553.
What would your number be otherwise?
I'm 38th from the beginning and 27th from the first Courtney Earl of Devon. So it depends where you count from, but we try to be modest, so we don't put out the Earl of Shrewsbury's. We don't make him feel too inadequate.
Sure. Yes, because you would be the premier Earl in England if the numbers had followed in that manner.
Yes, and actually, interestingly, the creation from Mary says that you shall hold your title as if from the first of your family to hold the title, which would put us back into the 1330s. But I think it was decided that it's best not to put your head too high above the parapet. We've lost our heads rather often, and so it pays to be a little bit discreet and come in at number 5.
Well, we completely understand. Curt and I are both very interested in someone I know you've studied, and maybe you could acquaint our viewers with in a little more detail. And this has to do with the restoration of the earldom in the 1830s. Could you tell us about Kitty Courtney?
Yes, so William Kitty Courtney is the appears behind me in the portrait that you can see on the wall. This is William and his 13 sisters. He was the only child of William II Viscount, and he became the 3rd Viscount Courtney on the death of his father. William Kitty Courtney was a gay man and famously, scandalously, was involved in a relationship with William Beckford, which scandalized London and England in the 1780s. William Beckford was exiled. William Courtney, Kitty, stayed here at Powderham and proceeded to live as far as we could tell, a relatively openly gay life until in about 1811, someone filed gross indecency charges against him and he fled to America. And he lived on Manhattan Island between 1811 and 1814. He was an enemy. He was interned as an enemy of the state during the War of 1812. And when Napoleon fell in France, he moved to Paris and he lived out his days from 1815 to 1835 in exile in Paris. And it was only towards the end of his life, 1832, that his cousin, an ambitious young lawyer who was also clerk to the House of Lords, concluded that Kitty must be the heir to this earldom of Devon created by Queen Mary in 1553, petitioned the House of Lords, and the House of Lords confirmed, yes, the Courtney cadet branch at Powderham were the rightful heirs to this late medieval earldom. And since then, we have borne the title Earls of Devon.
Well, it's quite a tale. When I visited you a few years ago, you showed me one of the great treasures of your family history. And I don't know if you have it there with you, but maybe you could tell us about the Cartoonery and what is a Cartoonery and why is it such a treasure?
So this is a Cartoonery, or this is a box in which a Cartoonery lives. And this is, a Cartoonery is a Latin term for charters, and it's a book of charters. And the charters effectively are your title deeds. And it describes in early English and Latin all of the lands that the Courtney family held at the time. It was written in 1340 to 1420. But interestingly, at the start of this Cartoonery, and very rarely, appears a family tree. And this is one of the earliest family trees created, certainly for a private family. And this tells the history of the Courtney family from Athon through the Crusades and during their time in England. And you'll see the Courtney family crest, which is the 3 red spots of Christ's blood that were brought back from the Crusades. And this tells a fascinating story of the family history. And it tells the story that the family was telling in the 13 and 1400s. And predominantly, it emphasizes the family's connection with the great Norman families, the de Redvers and the de Brion families, which is not a story that we've told in modern times, but it shows that in that early modern, late medieval period, your connections to the Normans were much the most important part of your pedigree. We prefer to tell the Angevin and Burgundian stories because those family members were rather entertaining as well and went on to become emperors of Constantinople and to do great things in the Holy Lands.
Well, my goodness, what a genealogical and historical treasure. And of course, speaking of treasures, you live in one of the great treasure houses, and we'd love to talk a little bit about that. Curt, as you may know, leads our family heritage tours, often to the UK. We visit houses and gardens and private collections. And without being so rude as to invite ourselves to Powderham, we do hope, I know Curt and I hope to bring a group to visit you there one day. And I know Curt has some questions for you about Powderham. Take it away, Curt.
Thank you very much. I do indeed. Well, first of all, I want to ask you, Charlie, why what you're sitting in is called the Marble Hall.
The Marble Hall is called the Marble Hall predominantly for the marble floor that you see behind me. And this is you can see in the wall behind me 3 medieval looking doors. And they are the old openings from the medieval Great Hall into the kitchen, the pantry, and the buttery. And it's very much the traditional layout of a medieval Great Hall. So what is now the Marble Hall, which is a very comfortable sitting room, was the bottom of the original medieval Great Hall at Powderham.
You mentioned earlier about the roof repairs, and I know that's something that I think Americans don't have a real grasp of with historic English houses, because repairing a roof here is expensive, but it's not millions of pounds as it is in the UK, especially if you have a historic roof, and historic England obviously tells you what you can and cannot do. And I assume you mainly have a lead roof, I assume.
So we have all sorts of roofs here. One of the joys of Powderham is it's been built in so many building campaigns. The main roof actually over myself now, over the Great Hall, is a copper roof. We have lead roofs on a couple of the towers, and then slate roofs on the libraries. So the Georgian extension is a slate roof, and then the music room with its remarkable dome is actually coppered. So we have all sorts of different roof types which join in perfect ways.
I bet they're perfectly expensive. I remember maybe 10 years ago, there was a big sale at Ultra, and the primary purpose of the art was to raise the money to replace the roof, which I think was like 15 million pounds. It was just an astonishing amount of money. And I think that's something that's hard for most Americans, as I say, to get their head around. And the other thing, of course, is that it's not your typical, what we use in America, which are just sort of like asphalt shingles. This will last for hundreds of years once you get it done. So if it happens in your watch, you're good for another 150 years.
Yeah, my father was pleased that he didn't have to fork out for the roof. I think his father had done the copper roof. My father had left all the towers for me. So I've got the joy of doing the 30s and the towers. But, you know, one of the joys of this winter has been an opportunity with COVID, with the castle being closed down and with the government really focusing on some important heritage maintenance work, is they've supported us through Historic England and the Historic Houses Foundation to get this work done. So this winter has been an incredibly busy time for Powderham, despite there being very few visitors and obviously none of our hospitality business. But we've been able to do some of the basics, which are much needed here.
And that's what I was going to ask you about next. So that was a perfect segue. How have you dealt with COVID?
Yeah, a number of houses do lots of weddings. We do some weddings, but we're also a visitor business. And so we were able last summer to open for grounds and gardens, and a little bit in the castle for a sort of free flow. And then for the first time this year, we opened at wintertime. Powderham, the name derives from Polder, which means a marsh, and it's the village on the marsh. And Powderham sits above a marsh and so tends to get very soggy in winter. But this year we decided, with Exeter Christmas lights being shut down and the National Trust not doing their typical Christmas show at Killerton, that we'd have a go, because being a private house, we're able to be a bit lighter on our feet. And we strung some Christmas lights up around the castle and put Santa in the riding school, and had the most wonderful response. It was a really busy December, and something hopefully we'll be able to repeat again once we sort out the drainage in the car parking.
Actually, all of these things are really helpful to illustrate to Americans what it's like to own a historic house in Britain. Because I know when I lecture about these houses, Americans think that everybody's waltzing around wearing a coronet and have loads of money and no worries. And what you're describing is the perfect struggle, because it is a struggle to maintain a historic house, and the bits and pieces that continue to fall down. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, you guys live in the stable block, don't you? You don't actually live in the house.
Yeah, we lived here for 4 years after my father died, and we moved into the castle with a young family. We overflowed the bath, or my daughter did at one stage, in our bathroom, which ran through into the medieval kitchen, and knocked out a little bit of plasterwork, just a little rosette of plasterwork in the ceiling. And so we thought, well, there's a small insurance claim, we'll get that fixed. But obviously, in fixing the plaster, you have to go back to the next solid bit of plaster, and that took us to the beam in the medieval kitchen. So we pulled the plaster off the beam, only to discover that the beam itself has a massive structural crack in it, that had been fixed by a sort of bodged job sometime around the 1860s. And obviously, having discovered it, it was like, we'll need to fix this. And we haven't yet been able to. It's taken an awful lot of work with the planners and with the heritage authorities to get consent, hopefully to keep the beam in place, to put some steel supports around it. But it's meant those bedrooms are out of use, and it's been rather easier for us to decamp to the stables, which is built in 1775, so is a very modern and comfortable house in comparison to this one.
Well, actually, that's another perfect segue for me. What is the oldest part of the house that you're aware of?
So Powderham was built in 1390, and this room that I'm in is the sort of modern reinterpretation of that space. But the space here is a typical medieval great hall with, as I said, the kitchen, the pantry, and the buttery behind me, and this rather remarkable sort of Georgian interior, which was created in about 1740s. And behind me, you'll see the Stumbles clock that was put in, William Stumbles of Tortoise, at about that time, 1740s. The family had left the house in 1645. The house was a royalist stronghold during the Civil War. And it was besieged in the cold winter of 1645, and effectively slighted and badly damaged. And so for about 50 years, we lived outside of Powderham. We lived at Ford House in Newton Abbot. And it wasn't until about 1700 that the family moved back in and began to domesticate this rather wonderful space. And domestication took rather particular forms, which I might be able to show you in a minute.
Well, speaking of wonderful spaces, I'm going to read a quote from Mark Girard, who I think is sort of the dean of British architecture historians, about what I think is the most amazing space there. One of the half dozen or so most sumptuous surviving examples of Rococo plasterwork in England. It is as though the Palladian barriers had suddenly broken down and a tremendous Rococo flood came sweeping into the castle, leaving, when it had subsided, an extraordinary and wonderful miscellany of objects thickly encrusted on walls and ceilings. I, of course, am talking about the staircase hall, which I think most people watching today will be aware of because of the movie The Remains of the Day, the Merchant Ivory movie.
Exactly. Well, the staircase hall just happens to be the other half of the medieval Great Hall. So as I go through this door into the staircase hall, you can hopefully see it behind me. And this is the Rococo staircase hall at Powderham.
The thing I think is so interesting about this is that it's famous for that acid blue color, but my understanding is that that wasn't put on until the early 20th century.
Yeah, we've done some paint samples lately, but its original color, we suspect, you can see on the door behind me, is more of a sort of pastel Georgian blue, and possibly what they did in the Edwardian period when they were redecorating was trying to replicate that, but they've given it this this rather more symmetric blue color, which is particularly distinctive.
This is one of the most important Rococo spaces in Britain, and it's an amazing opportunity for us to be able to see it live with its owner, which is just so wicked cool. And the other thing I'd like to ask about, because I love furniture, is John Shannon's bookcases, which are unlike anything else that I've ever seen. I know they're owned by the V&A now, but they're on long-term loan to Powderham. Can you possibly show us those or talk to us about those?
I walk through from the staircase hall into the anteroom. Hopefully the Wi-Fi will. Oh, and there behind me
there it is
the Shannon bookcase.
Astonishing. And what's the most amazing is they're also made in the West Country, which is unusual as well.
John Shannon is an Exeter cabinet maker, and it's one of the real joys of Powderham. The plasterers, indeed, for the staircase hall behind me were Exeter plasterers, and John Shannon himself was an Exeter cabinet maker. And what he obviously did, because if you notice the way that it's made, it has this amazing sort of Charles Andre Boule style of brass.
And so the understanding is that Shannon must have gone to Paris at some point early in his life, and in Paris would have learnt this amazing skill, which he brought back to his native Exeter and employed at Powderham. And then he moved up to London and became a great cabinet maker, operating from St. Martin's Lane in the middle of London until his death. But interestingly, the Powderham bookcases are the only piece of work, I think, that John Shannon actually signed. So for many years, they had no idea who this great cabinet maker was who was creating these French-style brass inlaid pieces until they came to Powderham and found his nameplate on the Powderham bookcases.
I also say to our American audience, one of the reasons why why Wi-Fi is so difficult in historic houses is because the walls are so thick and it takes an enormous amount of signals to get through.
Exactly. It's been a real challenge to get Wi-Fi throughout the castle, and we're not quite there.
Also, you cannot run wires through the walls quite like you can in a modern house. So you have to get consent for every piece of work you do. But also, it's quite nice to be in a space where Wi-Fi can't reach you.
Oh, I understand that. And what you just said about consent is something else that doesn't really exist in America, which historic houses, a listed building, and yours, of course, is grade 1 listed. You can't really do anything without permission of the government that involves the fabric of a historic house. And that I know has its benefits as well as its frustrations.
It does have benefits, but yeah, my wife will be able to tell you about the frustrations.
And speaking of your wife and the fact that I believe your children were both born in California, were they not?
Correct, yes, that they are Anglo-American in every way.
So that is, to me, the most important question I have for you today. What are their accents?
I think they'd be, I think their American friends would say they have English accents and their English friends say they have American accents. So they're hovering somewhere around Bermuda, I think.
A wonderful place to be, Bermuda. Back over to Brenton, who I think will have some closing remarks for us.
Well, Charlie, thank you so much for that tour. And if you haven't had the chance to visit Powderham in person, I hope all our viewers will have that opportunity at some point. And after COVID, as I said, Curt and I would very much enjoy bringing a group of our patrons to see it in person. But I just wanted to close with asking you about a special resident of Powderham. Curt actually met her, and you, of course, knew her very well. And that was Timothy the Tortoise, who had an amazing history at Powderham.
When my grandfather died, the short version of his obituary was Timothy outlives another one.
And Timothy was a remarkable tortoise who was a ship's mascot, collected on a Royal Navy frigate at the Siege of Sebastopol during the Crimean War in 1852. And Timothy lived on this ship for a number of years until the ship was redeployed to the South Atlantic, at which point Timothy hopped off the ship and went to stay with the sister of one of the officers, who happened to be my great-great-grandmother. And so she came, Timothy, into the family in about 1905, when my great-grandmother married my great-grandfather Frederick, and moved to Powderham in about 1920. And Timothy was always called Timothy, thought Timothy was a boy. It wasn't until the 1980s that Timothy went for the first time to a vet, and it was discovered that Timothy was female. And Timothy survived up until 2004. And so the understanding was Timothy was full grown when she was picked up. And so would have been at least 20, 30 years old in 1850. And you can do the maths. She lived a very, very long time. And she never was looked after. She hibernated herself under the wisteria bush every year, but during World War II, when she chose quite sensibly to hibernate under the stone steps, a little safer. And she loved tomatoes and was a fantastic character, and just lived openly in the Rose Garden at Powderham.
Brenton, I'm going to give a plug to a book that has a chapter on Charlie and AJ in it, which came out last year. This is the book, and it's published, actually written by Clive Aslett, who's the former editor of Country Life, and it's called Old Homes, New Life. And it focuses on private English country houses that are primarily lived in today by young families and how they're managing. And the one thing that I take away from this, I read this chapter again last night on you, Charlie, was something AJ said, "Charlie, my hippie feminist husband." I just thought that was the best quote ever. And this is a wonderful book that I recommend to anybody. You can get it on Amazon.
Charlie, thank you so much for spending this time with us. You have a rain check to visit us in Boston. We had a special program planned last year for Charlie in Boston, postponed due to COVID-19. And we hope you and AJ will visit us here in Boston in the not too distant future. And we would love to see you again in Devon. Thank you.
I'm much looking forward to it. And I'm much looking forward to anyone coming to visit. And you know, if you're an American visitor in the UK, do come and say hi, and you'll be sure of a warm welcome and hopefully a cream tea done the correct way.
Oh my.
Thank you so much, Charlie.